Okay, so we're finally here. And by here, I mean the place in Assyrian history where most people who have an interest in this stuff find the most fascinating. I'm talking specifically about the phase historians call Neo-Assyrian. If you're not familiar with this series, basically we started in episode 1 with a look at the very beginnings of the Assyrian people, how they started out as nomads, and later founded a relatively insignificant city-state called Ashur. We then went on over several centuries and saw how the fortunes of the Assyrians rose and fell. However, beginning around 912, 911 BCE, the tide consistently turned in favor of the Assyrians, and they formed what many historians believe was the first great empire. Now, of course, that's debatable because some people think, or some historians believe, that the empire of Sargon of Akkad was actually the first great empire. But again, when we're dealing with ancient history, it's always hard to tell, or at least to know for certain. The Assyrians did this, of course, by gobbling up kingdoms and new territories that resulted in their eventual control of Mesopotamia, much of Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and southwestern Iran. Pretty much all of the ancient Near East that was of any real significance. So when and how did this all happen? As mentioned in the last episode of the series, after the death of the great Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I, things began to go a bit awry for the empire. First of all, it ceased to really be an empire because almost as quickly as they had won new territories, the Assyrians lost them as the indigenous peoples of their latest conquest would revolt and in many cases obtain their independence. This was actually made all the more easier because Tiglath-Pileser's successors were more occupied in fighting each other than in actually expanding or at least maintaining the empire that they'd inherited. As can be expected, more peoples revolted and thus became free of the Assyrian yoke. Some of these peoples, such as the Aramaeans, who during Tiglath-Pileser's time were constantly crossing over into Assyrian territory as migrants, had now become powerful enough to stay there and eventually even establish kingdoms of their own. So basically, by the 11th and 10th centuries BCE, the once mighty Assyrian Empire, the one that had actually defeated the Hittites and other regional rivals, was basically a shadow of its former self. It had gone from being an empire that was feared by its neighbors to basically being I don't want to say insignificant state. It was still very significant, but a state that had to essentially fight to preserve its own original borders. And by the original borders, I mean what was the home province of Assyria. I like to use maybe a modern analogy of Great Britain. As you probably know, the British Empire was at one time the absolute largest in the world. In fact, there was a phrase that went, "The sun never set on the British Empire," because their territories pretty much expanded across all time zones and in all hemispheres of the world, north, south, east, and west. Not only this, but the British Empire was also one of the wealthiest states in the world, and they also had some of the best technology, both industrially and militarily. Eventually, though, the empire started to lose a grip on many of its colonies, especially really profitable ones like India and other parts of Asia. By World War II, it was pretty obvious that the British could not hold on to all of these territories, and also they had to contend with new rising powers, for example, Nazi Germany. In the end, the British were doing everything that they could to defend their actual homeland versus expanding. So, okay, this might be a little bit of a stretch, but it's kind of an analogy that I use for Assyria during this time. This once mighty empire of the ancient world was retracting and really just fighting to hold on to whatever they had. Ultimately, their neighbors banded together and were strong enough to, while not conquer Assyria, at least basically put them on the defensive. Things, though, began to change during the reign of the Assyrian king Ashur Dan II. Becoming king of Assyria in 934 BCE, Ashur Dan did something that few, if any, Assyrian kings had done in recent memory. That is, he went on both military campaigns to solidify Assyria's borders as well as to expand his realm. Now, it's always a good sign when an ancient nation or state leaves behind a lot of writings and records. That essentially means that the particular nation or state at that time was relatively prosperous and had interesting things to actually write about. For example, a lot of records from commercial activity would indicate prosperity, while written deeds to the properties of, for example, the dedication of a new temple and palaces meant that there were enough resources for such grand projects. Of course, the writing of kings and their great deeds, namely military activities, meant that conquests were also taking place. Now, of course, we should take everything that we read with a pound of salt, but the fact that we do have such documents means that at least there was something, even if a little exaggerated, to be written about. And so we start to see this during the reign of Ashur Dan II. In one particular inscription of his, he tells us that he finally defeated a people, possibly a tribe of Arameans, who had been destroying Assyrian towns and killing their population since the time of Shalmaneser II, a king who reigned almost 100 years before him, from the years, I think it was 1030 to 1019 BCE. Another inscription tells of groups of war-torn Assyrians who had to flee their homes due to hunger and famine. He essentially won back their towns and villages and resettled them back into their original homes, all in peace. Probably mindful that he didn't have the men nor the resources to go on grand campaigns of foreign conquest like Tiglath-Pileser I, Ashur Dan focused on revitalizing the Assyrian economy at home and strengthening the territories immediately around the Assyrian heartland, especially those to the north of the capital of Ashur, which was basically prone to constant attacks by confederations of hill tribes. Now, in all of these things, Ashur Dan II was quite successful, and ultimately he provided a solid base from which future kings could capitalize on. It turns out that many of his successors did just this. The first of these was Ashur Dan's successor, Adad-Nirari II. Becoming king after the death of his father in 911 BCE, Adad-Nirari campaigned heavily in the areas northwest of Ashur and into the mountains beyond the Tur Abdin range in what is today southwestern Turkey. To record Assyria's newfound might and power, Adad-Nirari left behind plenty of inscriptions written in, or covering rather, everything from the founding of new cities, the building of temples, and of course, what was by now a common theme, brutally and decisively subduing the enemies of Assyria. Now, Adad-Nirari II is not at all shy about his exploits, as many of his inscriptions read. I'm actually going to read one of them to you right now. I quote, "In the days when at the command of the great gods my lordly sovereignty has manifested itself, going forth to plunder the goods of the lands, I am royal, I am lordly, I am mighty, I am honored, I am exalted, I am glorified, I am powerful, I am all-powerful, I am brilliant, I am lion brave, I am manly, I am supreme, I am noble. Adad-Nirari, the mighty king, the king of Assyria, the king of the four regions of the world, who slays his enemies, am I. The king, powerful in battle, who overthrows cities, who burns the mountains of the lands, am I. Strong hero, who consumes his enemies, who burns up the wicked and the evil, am I. Like fire I burn, like the storm I cast down, who has no conqueror, who none can subdue." End of quote. So I think we get the point from that passage that Mr. Adad-Nirari II was a pretty big deal, at least in his own mind. In some ways, though, his confidence reflects that of Assyria in general during that time period. The empire was on the upswing, prospering like it never had in centuries. With a strategy of progressive but sustainable expansion, the Assyrian Empire was finally able to not only conquer new territory, but hold on to it as well. Now, of course, the Assyrians have a reputation for being extremely brutal, and let's be honest, in many cases, this reputation is actually well-deserved. However, at times, we do see a more merciful side of Adad-Nirari II, especially for those who either surrendered up front to him or after defeat came back to their homes. In one campaign against a people known as the Kumani, Adad-Nirari claims to have taken, and I quote, "the rest of their troops who had fled before my weapons, but come back, I settled in peaceful dwellings." End of quote. Now, this probably wasn't done purely out of altruism. I'm pretty sure that the defeated and conquered people no doubt had to work the land, provided many goods, and paid high taxes to their Assyrian overlords. But I suppose they got to keep their lives and were not blinded or mutilated like other Assyrian kings had done to their defeated enemies in years past. Adad-Nirari II was extremely focused on building up the resources of his empire as efficiently as possible. And so if he felt that a conquered people no longer posed a threat to him and could, for the most part, work better in their native land versus being relocated to another, well, then so be it. His goal was not to impose punishment, but increase productivity, which led to greater prosperity for Assyria overall. A similar path of least destruction was true with Assyria's dealing with its regional rival, Babylonia. The latter had taken advantage of Assyria's weakness during the previous century to seize their territory and control the profitable trade routes that lied within them. Adad-Nirari II not only took these territories back, but also expanded his southern border and put the Babylonians on the defensive. Instead of raiding Babylon like his predecessors Tukulti Ninurta I and Tiglath-Pileser I, he instead laid claim to the city through a marriage alliance. Thus, he was able to call himself the conqueror of Cardanush, or all of Babylonia, through these means. Now, as we've discussed in other segments, there was one people who were consistently a thorn in the side of the Assyrians, and these were the various tribes of Aramaeans who were infiltrating into Assyrian lands and setting up independent settlements of their own. Assyrian kings were constantly having to deal with them from the time of Tiglath-Pileser I, a few hundred years earlier, which was around 1100 BCE. So actually, sorry, it's more like for 150, 200 years before the time period that we're talking about right now. Anyway, since the time they'd first come onto the scene, the Aramaeans had overall grown much stronger. Adad-Nirari II tells us that he fought at least 6 annual campaigns against them. He was finally successful, though, when he surrounded one of the major chiefs of the Aramaean Confederation at a city known as Nisibin, basically by laying siege to the city and starving the population and the chieftain into submission. Shortly afterward, other Aramaean tribes sent gifts to the great Assyrian king and became his vassals. Thus, the Assyrians' Aramaean problem, at least for the time being, had been pacified. Again, Adad-Nirari II seems to have only resulted to the use of great military force when he felt that it was absolutely necessary. If he could take an area without expending too many resources, this to him was obviously preferable. He didn't need to make a grand statement by massacring large populations. Just showing that he had the power to do so was enough for him. Not all of his successors, though, would be inclined to do the same. Adad-Nirari II's son, Tukulti Ninurta II, continued his father's policy of consolidating and expanding Assyria's northernmost borders, acquiring thousands of horses in the process. This laid the foundation for what would soon be Assyria's legendary and fearsome cavalry. Basically, up until now, the Assyrian weapon of choice had been shooting arrows and other projectiles from some sort of longbow, often from chariots. With more horses, it was possible to greatly expand what up until then had been a formidable but generally small force of cavalry. Tukulti Ninurta II also had to deal with renewed hostilities with the Babylonians, who tried to test the new king to see if he had the same mettle as his father. It turns out that he did. The Babylonians lost even more territory, to the point that the Assyrians moved their southern border today to what we'd call the suburbs of Babylon, which I think is basically around what's currently modern Baghdad. The good thing for Tukulti Ninurta II was that the Aramaeans, with only a few exceptions, were for the most part content to remain his vassals. However, this may not have been out of fear of the Assyrians as much as it may have been their mutually beneficial commercial links with them. There have been so many cuneiform account ledgers from the time period that have been discovered that show all the goods that the Aramaeans traded with, as well as the regions that they also dealt with. For example, they controlled commerce between Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, the Arabian Peninsula, and also other areas along Assyria's periphery. In this process, the Aramaeans had become extremely wealthy. Not only did they deal in traditional gold and silver items, but also with viable metals such as tin, bronze, iron, as well as luxury items such as, I guess the big popular one at the time was ivory inlaid furniture, along with different types of silk and really expensive textiles from all over the world. Essentially, you could say the Aramaeans were the Mesopotamian pioneers of the ancient Silk Road of the time. They also supplied their Assyrian overlords with copious amounts of grain, cattle, sheep, ducks, and a whole host of other foodstuffs. So this actually was a pretty good time in Assyria's history. The next great Assyrian king that we're going to talk about is Ashur Dan II, but we'll go more into his story in the next episode. Thanks again everyone for listening. If you liked this video, if it was helpful, please hit that like button because it definitely helps out the channel, and I hope to have more stuff for you soon. It's just that there's so much stuff that I'm reading on Assyria right now that it's hard to really take the good main juicy points and put them into a format that's sort of easy to digest and that I can do or that I can put in a relatively concise program. So I'm working on that stuff. So I thank you guys who are listening, and we'll have something for you hopefully really soon. Until next time.